in the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where every footstep echoes with centuries of royal tradition. A small figure in a navy blue coat walks deliberately down the corridor. Her blonde hair catches the morning light streaming through ancient windows, and for a moment, visitors mistake her for someone else entirely. The resemblance is uncanny, almost haunting. But this isn't Princess Kate making her way to a royal engagement. This is 10-year-old Princess Charlotte, and she's walking completely alone. What the cameras don't capture, what the carefully orchestrated royal photographs never show, is the weight of isolation that already rests on such young shoulders. Behind the palace gates, away from the cheering crowds and waving flags, a different story unfolds. It's a story that a veteran royal protection officer, after 30 years of sworn silence, finally felt compelled to share. People see the tiaras and the fairy tale, he says, his weathered hands clasped tightly as he speaks for the first time about what he witnessed. But they don't see the little girl who sometimes sits by herself for hours, practicing how to wave properly, or the way she straightens her shoulders when she thinks no one is looking, just like her mother does. This is that untold story, a story of a child caught between two worlds, the innocence of childhood and the inexorable pull of royal destiny. It's about the moments when the cameras stop rolling, when the palace doors close, and when a young princess must navigate the complex landscape of duty, family expectations, and her own emerging identity. Some stories are too important to remain buried in palace protocols and media restrictions. This is one of them. The first time Detective Inspector Sarah Blackwood noticed the striking resemblance was during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June 2022. As part of the specialized Royal Protection Unit, she had been positioned near the balcony where the royal family would appear for the traditional flyover. Through her earpiece, she could hear the coordinated movements of her team, the careful choreography that kept the royals safe while maintaining the illusion of casual public appearance. But it wasn't the security protocols that caught her attention that day. It was the way 7-year-old Princess Charlotte stood beside her mother, unconsciously mirroring every gesture. When the Duchess of Cambridge adjusted her hat, Charlotte's small hand moved to her own head. When Kate stepped slightly forward to acknowledge the crowd, Charlotte's feet shuffled in the same direction. The child wasn't doing it deliberately, it was as natural as breathing. "She's absorbing everything," Sarah whispered to her partner, Constable David Mills, who had been working royal security for over 15 years. David nodded grimly. He had seen it happen before with previous generations, but never quite like this. The Cambridge children lived a carefully balanced life between Kensington Palace and their country home in Norfolk. Unlike their father, who had grown up entirely within the royal bubble, William and Kate had made deliberate choices to give their children what they called normal experiences. Charlotte attended Thomas's Battersea, the same prep school as her older brother George, where she was encouraged to participate in after-school activities just like any other child. But normal was relative when your every move was documented by protection officers and your playmates had to be security cleared in advance. Sarah often watched Charlotte during school pickup, noting how the young princess would scan the crowd of parents and nannies before her eyes settled on her mother. Even at 7, she had learned to be aware of her surroundings in a way that most children never needed to be. The real transformation began when Charlotte turned 8. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable except to those who observed the family daily. During public engagements, Charlotte began to study her mother with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. When the Duchess of Cambridge knelt to speak to children at charity events, Charlotte would position herself nearby, watching how her mother's face changed, how her voice softened, how she made each person feel as though they were the only one in the room. Maria Santos, who served as Charlotte's nanny during this period, later described the child's behavior during these learning moments. "She wasn't just watching," Maria explained during a private conversation with Sarah years later. "She was cataloging everything, the way the Duchess held her handbag, how she stepped out of the car, even how she smiled for photographs. Charlotte would practice these things when she thought no one was looking. The mimicry extended beyond public appearances. At Anmer Hall, their Norfolk retreat, Charlotte began to adopt her mother's mannerisms during family dinners. She sat with the same straight posture, used the same gestures when speaking, and even developed a similar way of tilting her head when listening to others. The family staff noticed that Charlotte had begun to correct her younger brother Louis when his behavior didn't meet what she considered appropriate standards. "Master Louis, we don't put our elbows on the table," she would say, her voice carrying an authority that seemed startling from someone so young. The correction wasn't said with childish bossiness, but with the same gentle firmness that the Duchess of Cambridge used when guiding her children in public. The pressure of this unconscious training became more apparent during the family's 22-3 Christmas preparations. Sarah was part of the security detail during the traditional Christmas Eve service at St. George's Chapel. She watched as Charlotte prepared for the walk from the castle to the chapel, a journey that would be photographed by dozens of cameras and scrutinized by millions around the world. In a small anteroom, Charlotte stood before an ornate mirror, adjusting her coat and hat with movements that perfectly echoed her mother's pre-engagement routine. The 8-year-old's face was serious, concentrated, as she practiced the smile she would wear for the cameras. It wasn't the natural, carefree smile of childhood, but the measured, appropriate expression she had learned through countless observations. Kate entered the room and stood behind her daughter, both of them reflected in the ancient mirror. For a moment, they looked like the same person, separated by 30 years. The Duchess placed her hands on Charlotte's shoulders, and both of them unconsciously straightened at the same moment. "You look perfect, darling," Kate said softly. But Charlotte continued to adjust her appearance, clearly not satisfied with her reflection. "Is my smile right?" Charlotte asked, practicing the expression again. "It needs to be just like yours." Kate's reflection in the mirror showed a flash of something that might have been concern, quickly replaced by her characteristic composure. "Your smile should be your own, Charlotte. You don't need to copy anyone." But Charlotte was already turning away, having perfected the expression she wanted. As they walked toward the chapel, Sarah noticed that the young princess's demeanor had shifted entirely. The child, who had been laughing with her brothers earlier in the day, had been replaced by someone who seemed to be performing a role she had studied extensively. During the service, Charlotte sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap exactly as her mother's were. When it was time to stand for hymns, she rose with the same graceful movement that Kate had perfected over years of public appearances. The congregation might have seen it as natural poise, but Sarah recognized it as learned behavior from someone far too young to have developed such skills naturally. The most telling moment came during the greeting portion of the service, when the royal family would shake hands with various dignitaries and church officials. As Charlotte approached each person with the same measured steps as her mother, extending her hand at precisely the right moment, maintaining eye contact for exactly the appropriate duration. Her smile never wavered, never became too broad or too reserved. But Sarah noticed something else. Throughout the entire interaction, Charlotte's eyes would periodically dart toward her mother, seeking approval or confirmation that she was performing correctly. The anxiety was subtle but present, visible only to someone trained to observe human behavior under pressure. After the service, as the family made their way back to the castle, Charlotte's carefully maintained composure began to crack. The weight of performing perfectly for over an hour was taking its toll. Her steps became slightly less measured, her smile more forced. By the time they reached the private family quarters, she was walking with the tired gait of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden. Sarah's partner, David, had been watching too. As they completed their shift that evening, he shared his observations with her. "She's too young for this level of pressure," he said quietly. "I've been doing this job for 16 years, and I've seen what it does to adults. She's 8 years old, and she's already carrying herself like she's preparing for a state dinner." The conversation weighed on Sarah's mind as she drove home that night. She had joined the Royal Protection Unit because she believed in service, in protecting people who served the public. But watching Charlotte struggle with expectations that would challenge most adults made her question whether protection extended beyond physical safety. During the following weeks, Sarah began to pay closer attention to Charlotte's behavior during routine activities. The family's daily life in Norfolk during the Christmas holidays provided opportunities to observe how the young princess navigated the space between childhood and royal obligation. Even in the relative privacy of Anmere Hall, Charlotte seemed unable to fully relax into being just a child. During family games in the sitting room, she would monitor her own behavior, correcting herself when she laughed too loudly or forgot to keep her dress pulled down properly. She had internalized lessons about public behavior so thoroughly that she was applying them even when no public was present. The most heartbreaking moment Sarah witnessed occurred during a family sledding expedition on the estate grounds. For the first hour, Charlotte played with the abandon typical of her age, racing down the hill with her brothers, her laughter echoing across the snowy landscape. But when a photographer with a long lens was spotted in the distance, even though they were on private property, Charlotte's demeanor changed instantly. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her winter coat, and began to sled with careful photogenic movements. The joy had been replaced by performance. Even though she was still technically at play, her brothers continued their chaotic fun, but Charlotte had shifted into what Sarah began to think of as Duchess mode, the careful, controlled version of herself that she presented to the world. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would prove significant in the months to come. She began to keep detailed notes about Charlotte's behavior, not for any official report, but because she felt someone needed to document what was happening to this child. She didn't know yet where these observations would lead, but she felt a responsibility to bear witness to Charlotte's experience. The notes would later become the foundation for her decision to speak publicly about what she had observed, breaking decades of silence maintained by royal protection officers. But that night, writing in a simple notebook in her flat in London, Sarah was simply trying to make sense of what she was seeing. A young girl losing pieces of her childhood to the inexorable demands of preparing for a role she had never chosen but could never escape. The spring of 2024 brought with it a series of events that would fundamentally change how Charlotte navigated her young life. The Princess of Wales's cancer diagnosis, announced in March, created ripples throughout the royal family that extended far beyond the public's understanding. For 9-year-old Charlotte, it meant watching her mother face a battle that no amount of royal training had prepared her for. Detective Inspector Sarah Blackwood was part of the enhanced security detail during this period, when the Wales family's privacy became even more crucial to protect. She witnessed firsthand how Charlotte responded to this crisis, and what she saw both impressed and deeply concerned her. In the weeks following the diagnosis announcement, Charlotte's behavior shifted in ways that were remarkable for someone her age. She had always been observant of her mother's actions, but now she seemed to be studying Kate with an intensity that bordered on surveillance. During family walks around the Windsor estate, Charlotte would position herself where she could see her mother's face, watching for any sign of fatigue or discomfort. She was reading her mother like a book, Sarah later recalled, not in the way a worried child might, but with this analytical quality that seemed far beyond her years. She was assessing, calculating, almost like she was preparing for something. The something Charlotte was preparing for became clear during a private garden party at Kensington Palace in late April. The event was small, limited to close family friends and a few charitable organizations that Kate had supported before her diagnosis. It was intended to be low-key, but Charlotte seemed to understand that every public appearance during this period carried additional weight. Sarah watched as Charlotte prepared for the garden party with the same meticulous attention she had previously applied to major royal events. In her mother's absence from the final preparations, Charlotte took it upon herself to inspect the table settings, checking that the flower arrangements were positioned correctly and that the staff had arranged the chairs precisely as they should be. When questioned by the household staff about these inspections, Charlotte replied with startling directness, "Mama can't worry about these details right now. Everything must be perfect for her." The garden party itself revealed the full extent of Charlotte's transformation. Kate appeared for only 30 minutes, looking pale but determined to fulfill her obligations to the attending guests. During this brief appearance, Charlotte shadowed her mother with subtle precision, always positioned where she could step in if needed, always alert to her mother's energy levels. But it was what happened after Kate retreated back to the house that proved most revealing. Rather than joining her brothers in play, Charlotte remained at the party, moving among the guests with a composure that stunned the adults present. She thanked people for their support of her mother, inquired about their own charitable work, and even managed several conversations about organizations she was too young to fully understand. Lady Margaret Thornbury, a longtime family friend who attended the garden party, later described her conversation with Charlotte to Sarah's colleague. "She spoke like a 40-year-old diplomat," Lady Margaret said. "She thanked me for my continued support during this challenging time and assured me that the family was deeply grateful for everyone's kindness and prayers. these weren't a child's words. She was channeling something she had absorbed from years of watching royal interactions. The most striking moment came when Charlotte noticed an elderly gentleman who seemed lost and was standing alone near the garden's edge. Without hesitation, she approached him, introduced herself with a perfect curtsy, and guided him to where refreshments were being served. Throughout their conversation, she maintained the same engaged eye contact and attentive posture that her mother was famous for. Sarah, observing from her security position, felt a chill watching this interaction. The 9-year-old princess was performing flawlessly in a role she had never been formally trained for, drawing entirely on observations she had made of her mother over the years. It was impressive and deeply troubling in equal measure. The real test of Charlotte's emerging capabilities came during the Trooping the Color preparations in June 2024. Kate's participation in the event had been uncertain due to her ongoing treatment, and plans had been made for various contingencies. Charlotte seemed to understand the significance of this uncertainty better than anyone anticipated. During rehearsals at the parade ground, Charlotte observed everything with the intensity of someone studying for an exam. She watched how her mother stood during the ceremony, noting the angle of her head during the national anthem, the precise timing of her curtsies, the way she acknowledged different sections of the crowd. When Kate had to take breaks due to fatigue, Charlotte would continue watching other senior members of the family, absorbing their protocols as well. The breakthrough moment came during a particularly difficult rehearsal, when Kate, despite her best efforts, was clearly struggling with the physical demands of the extended standing required for the ceremony. Charlotte, without being asked or even acknowledged by the adults around her, moved to position herself in a way that would provide visual support for her mother while maintaining the formation's requirements. Colonel James Matthews, who was coordinating the family's participation in the ceremony, initially moved to correct Charlotte's position, but he quickly realized that her placement was not only appropriate, but demonstrated an understanding of royal protocol that was genuinely impressive. She had instinctively known how to provide support while maintaining the ceremony's dignity. "Your Royal Highness has quite remarkable spatial awareness," the colonel told Charlotte after the rehearsal, using her formal title in recognition of her mature behavior. Charlotte's response stayed with Sarah for months afterward. "I've been watching, sir. I know where everyone needs to be." The actual Trooping the Color ceremony proved to be a watershed moment for public perception of Charlotte. Photographs from the event showed her standing with perfect posture throughout the lengthy proceedings, her attention never wavering from the ceremony's requirements. But what the cameras didn't capture were the small acts of support she provided to her mother throughout the day. During the carriage procession, Charlotte monitored her mother's energy levels, engaging her in quiet conversation when Kate seemed to be flagging, and maintaining a cheerful demeanor that seemed designed to boost her mother's spirits. On the palace balcony, she positioned herself strategically to provide Kate with subtle physical support while making it appear like natural family closeness. The most remarkable moment came during the flyover, when Charlotte noticed that her mother was swaying slightly on her feet. Without breaking her own perfect posture or drawing any attention to the situation, Charlotte shifted her weight to provide a discreet anchor point that Kate could lean against. The 9-year-old had provided physical support to her mother while maintaining the visual perfection that royal appearances demanded. Sarah's notes from that day recorded her growing concern about what she was witnessing. Charlotte is performing at a level that would impress seasoned diplomats, but she's 9 years old. She's providing emotional and physical support to her mother while managing her own public responsibilities. This isn't childhood anymore. This is duty at an age when most children are worried about playground friendships and school projects. The weeks following Trooping the Color brought a new challenge that would test Charlotte's rapidly developing diplomatic skills. The Wales family began hosting small, private meetings with various charitable organizations and community leaders as Kate gradually returned to public duties. These meetings required a level of social sophistication that most adults found challenging. Charlotte began attending these meetings, initially just as a presence in the room while she worked on school assignments or read. But Sarah noticed that she was absorbing every interaction, learning how different types of conversations were conducted, understanding the subtle differences between formal and informal royal communication. During one particularly challenging meeting with representatives from a children's mental health charity, Charlotte's presence proved unexpectedly valuable. The discussion had become tense as the charity representatives pressed for increased royal patronage, while Kate tried to balance her support with the limitations imposed by her ongoing treatment. Without any prompting from the adults in the room, Charlotte looked up from her schoolwork and addressed the charity representatives directly. "My mama wants to help every child, but she has to be strong enough to help properly. Sometimes waiting a little bit means we can do much more later." The statement was simple enough for a 9-year-old to make naturally, but it diffused the tension in the room perfectly, while communicating the royal family's position with remarkable diplomatic precision. The charity representatives left the meeting feeling heard and respected rather than dismissed, and Kate was able to maintain her boundaries. Sarah's colleague David, who had also been present for this meeting, shared his observations with her afterward. "She's not just copying her mother anymore," he said. "She's thinking strategically about these interactions. She understood what needed to be communicated in that room, and she found a way to say it that worked for everyone. That's not mimicry. That's natural diplomatic instinct." This realization marked a turning point in Sarah's understanding of what she was observing. Charlotte wasn't simply learning to behave like a royal. She was developing genuine skills that allowed her to navigate complex social and political situations. But the cost of these skills was becoming increasingly apparent in her behavior during private family time. During off-duty hours at Anmer Hall, Charlotte struggled to turn off the diplomatic persona she had developed. She would catch herself being overly formal with her brothers, correcting their behavior not with childish bossiness, but with the same gentle authority she had learned to use in public settings. When playing games, she had difficulty relaxing into genuine competitiveness, instead maintaining the measured responses that royal protocol demanded. The most telling incident occurred during a family movie night in July 2024. The Wales family had chosen a comedy that was age-appropriate for all 3 children, and initially everyone was enjoying the film together. But when Charlotte laughed at a particularly funny scene, she immediately covered her mouth and glanced around to make sure her response had been appropriate. "It's okay to laugh, darling," Kate told her gently. "We're just family here." Charlotte nodded, but Sarah, who was conducting security checks in the adjacent hallway, could see through the doorway that the child continued to monitor her own responses throughout the rest of the film. Even in the privacy of her own home, surrounded by her immediate family, Charlotte seemed unable to completely let go of the self-awareness that public life had demanded of her. The summer holidays brought some relief as the family spent extended time at their Norfolk estate with fewer official obligations. But even during this period, Charlotte's behavior suggested that she was always partially prepared for public scrutiny. During beach walks with the family dogs, she maintained better posture than her brothers. During family bicycle rides around the estate, she was consistently aware of her appearance in ways that seemed unnatural for her age. Sarah began to understand that Charlotte was living in a state of constant readiness, always prepared to shift into public mode at a moment's notice. This readiness had served the family well during Kate's health challenges, but it was extracting a price from Charlotte's ability to simply be a child. The end of the summer brought preparations for the new school year, and with it, new challenges for Charlotte's increasingly complex life. She would be entering her final year at Thomas's Battersea before moving on to secondary school, a transition that would normally be exciting for a 10-year-old. But Charlotte approached even this milestone with the careful consideration she had learned to apply to royal obligations. During a planning meeting with school officials, Charlotte asked questions about her academic schedule that demonstrated her awareness of how her education needed to balance with her growing royal responsibilities. She wanted to know which subjects would best prepare her for future diplomatic work, which extracurricular activities would provide useful skills for public engagements, and how her schedule could accommodate the increasing number of family obligations she was expected to fulfill. These were not the questions of a typical 10-year-old planning her school year. They were the enquiries of someone who understood that every choice she made would have implications for her future role. Sarah realized that Charlotte was no longer simply learning to be royal. She was actively planning her development toward that role with a sophistication that would have impressed career diplomats. The weight of these realizations began to affect Sarah's own sense of her role in the Royal Protection Unit. She had signed up to protect the royal family from external threats, but what she was witnessing felt like a different kind of danger: the gradual loss of childhood to the demands of institutional preparation. Her notes from this period reflect her growing conviction that someone needed to speak up about what was happening to Charlotte. even if it meant breaking the traditional silence that royal protection officers maintained throughout their careers. October 2024 marked the beginning of what Sarah would later describe as Charlotte's year of solitude. While the phrase might seem dramatic for a child surrounded by family, staff, and protection officers, Sarah had begun to recognize a particular type of isolation that was unique to Charlotte's position within the royal family. The catalyst for this period came during the preparation for the state visit of the South African president. The Wales family would play a supporting role in the formal ceremonies, but the planning process required numerous briefings and protocol meetings that Charlotte, now 10 years old, was expected to attend in preparation for her future responsibilities. During the first briefing session at Buckingham Palace, Sarah observed Charlotte sitting alone at a small desk positioned behind her parents, taking careful notes in a leather-bound notebook that had been specially provided for her use. While William and Kate participated in discussions about diplomatic protocols and ceremonial procedures, Charlotte was absorbing information about international relations that most adults would find challenging to follow. The isolation wasn't physical. The room was full of people, and Charlotte was clearly part of the proceedings. But there was an emotional distance that Sarah found deeply troubling. At 10 years old, Charlotte was the youngest person in the room by at least 25 years, trying to understand conversations about trade agreements, cultural sensitivities, and political implications that had nothing to do with childhood concerns. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah watched Charlotte organize her notes with methodical precision, creating sections for different aspects of the state visit preparations. Her handwriting was careful and mature, and her organizational system rivaled that of the adult civil servants present at the meeting. But when one of the palace staff members approached to ask if she needed anything, Charlotte looked up with an expression that seemed to Sarah like someone emerging from deep water, momentarily disoriented, as if she had to remember how to interact in casual conversation. "I'm quite well, thank you," Charlotte replied with perfect politeness. But Sarah noticed that she seemed relieved when the break ended and she could return to her note-taking. The social interaction, however brief and gentle, appeared to require more effort than the complex diplomatic briefing she was absorbing. This pattern repeated throughout the autumn. As Charlotte's involvement in royal preparations increased, Sarah observed her becoming more comfortable in formal, structured environments than in casual social situations. During family dinners at Kensington Palace, Charlotte would often seem slightly withdrawn, as if she were conserving energy for the official duties that now filled much of her schedule. The most striking example of this shift occurred during a Halloween celebration at the palace. The event was intended to be casual family time, with staff members' children invited to join the royal children for traditional Halloween activities. Charlotte participated dutifully, but Sarah noticed that she struggled to engage with the spontaneous play that characterized the evening. When the other children began an impromptu game of hide-and-seek through the palace corridors, Charlotte hesitated before joining in. Throughout the game, she seemed to be calculating which hiding spots would be appropriate, which areas of the palace might be off-limits even during family time. Her play was careful, considered, lacking the reckless joy that the other children exhibited. The most telling moment came when one of the staff children, a boy about Charlotte's age named Tommy, suggested they explore the staterooms where the Halloween decorations had been set up. The other children rushed toward these grand spaces with excitement, but Charlotte stopped them with gentle authority. "We should check if that's allowed," she said, her voice carrying the same diplomatic tone she used in official settings. "There might be important things being prepared in those rooms." Tommy, unaware of royal protocols, laughed and said, "But you're the princess! You can go anywhere you want." Charlotte's response revealed the complexity of her position. Being a princess means being more careful about where you go, not less careful. The exchange highlighted something that Sarah had been observing for months. Charlotte's understanding of her role had evolved beyond simply behaving appropriately in public. She had internalized the concept that her status brought additional responsibilities, rather than additional freedoms. For a 10-year-old, this represented a fundamental shift in how she related to the world around her. November brought the traditional preparations for the royal family's Christmas obligations, a period that would typically be exciting for any child. But for Charlotte, the Christmas season had become another series of protocols to master, performances to perfect, and diplomatic opportunities to navigate successfully. During a planning meeting for the Christmas carol service that the Princess of Wales traditionally hosts, Charlotte's role had evolved from simple attendance to active participation in the event's organization. She reviewed guest lists, discussed musical selections, and even provided input on the charitable organizations that would benefit from the service. Sarah was present during a conversation between Charlotte and the event coordinator, a discussion that would have been remarkable for its sophistication, even if conducted by an adult. Charlotte asked detailed questions about the accessibility arrangements for elderly guests, suggested modifications to the seating plan that would better accommodate families with young children, and proposed adjustments to the timing that would allow working parents to attend more easily. "Your Royal Highness has given considerable thought to the comfort of our guests," the coordinator remarked, clearly impressed by Charlotte's attention to detail. Charlotte's response demonstrated the depth of her understanding. "Mama always says that when people give their time to support good causes, we must make sure they feel welcomed and appreciated. The details matter because they show people we value their presence." The statement perfectly captured the philosophy behind effective royal engagement, but coming from a 10-year-old, it highlighted how completely Charlotte had absorbed lessons that most adults in similar positions took years to learn. Sarah realized that Charlotte was no longer learning royal protocol. She was thinking like someone who would one day be responsible for maintaining royal institutions. The Christmas Carol service itself proved to be a significant moment in Charlotte's development as a public figure. Unlike previous years when she had simply attended with her family, Charlotte now had specific responsibilities during the event. She greeted guests as they arrived, guided elderly attendees to their seats, and even participated in conversations with the charitable representatives about their work. But it was during the service itself that Sarah witnessed something that would haunt her for months afterward. As the congregation sang traditional Christmas carols, Charlotte's voice was clearly audible, beautiful and perfectly pitched, but while everyone around her sang with the joy typical of Christmas celebrations, Charlotte's expression remained composed, diplomatic, appropriate for her position. Sarah realized that Charlotte was performing even while singing Christmas carols with her family. The spontaneous joy that should characterize childhood participation in beloved traditions had been replaced by awareness of how her behavior would be observed and interpreted by others. Even in moments of family celebration, Charlotte seemed unable to completely abandon the careful self-monitoring that royal life demanded. The period between Christmas and New Year brought an unexpected revelation that would fundamentally change Sarah's understanding of Charlotte's situation. During a routine security sweep of the family's private apartments at Windsor Castle, Sarah discovered Charlotte in one of the smaller sitting rooms, having what appeared to be a detailed conversation with herself. Initially, Sarah assumed Charlotte was practicing a speech or rehearsing remarks for an upcoming engagement. But as she listened more carefully, she realized that Charlotte was conducting both sides of a diplomatic conversation, switching between her own voice and a slightly different tone as she played the role of various dignitaries she might encounter in future royal duties. "Your Royal Highness, it's such an honor to meet you," Charlotte said in a deeper voice, clearly representing an adult guest. "The pleasure is entirely mine," she replied in her normal voice with perfect royal inflection. "I understand your organization does remarkable work with disadvantaged youth." The conversation continued for several minutes, covering topics ranging from charitable funding to international development projects. Charlotte was essentially conducting diplomatic training exercises with herself, preparing for conversations she might need to navigate in the coming years. Sarah was struck not only by the sophistication of the material Charlotte was practicing, but by the fact that she was conducting this training entirely on her own initiative. No one had assigned her this exercise. She had identified a need to improve her conversational skills and had developed her own method for addressing it. When Charlotte noticed Sarah's presence, she didn't appear embarrassed or defensive about being discovered. Instead, she explained her practice session with the matter-of-fact tone she might use to describe homework preparation. "I've been listening to Mama's conversations with different types of guests," Charlotte said. "I want to make sure I understand how to talk to people about things they care about, even if I don't know very much about those topics yet." Sarah's response was carefully neutral, but internally she was deeply moved by this evidence of Charlotte's dedication to her future role. "That seems like very thoughtful preparation, Your Royal Highness." "I don't want to disappoint anyone," Charlotte replied simply. When people meet members of our family, it should be a good experience for them. This conversation marked a turning point in Sarah's understanding of Charlotte's situation. The child wasn't simply mimicking royal behavior or fulfilling obligations imposed by others. She had developed a genuine sense of responsibility for the experiences of people who would encounter the royal family, and she was taking active steps to ensure she could meet those responsibilities effectively. But this realization also intensified Sarah's concerns about the emotional cost of such precocious development. Charlotte was carrying a sense of duty that would be impressive in an adult but which seemed potentially overwhelming for a 10-year-old child. The new year brought intensified preparations for Charlotte's transition to secondary school, a process that revealed how completely her educational plans were now intertwined with her royal development. Rather than simply choosing a school based on academic programs or social fit, Charlotte's secondary education was being planned as part of her long-term preparation for royal duties. During meetings with potential schools, Charlotte asked questions that demonstrated her awareness of how her education would serve her future role. She inquired about language programs that would prepare her for international diplomatic work, history curricula that would deepen her understanding of constitutional monarchy, and extracurricular activities that would develop skills useful for public speaking and charitable engagement. These were practical considerations for someone in Charlotte's position, but they represented choices that most children never had to make. Every aspect of her education was being filtered through the lens of royal preparation, limiting the natural exploration and self-discovery that typically characterize adolescent development. The most poignant moment in these educational discussions came when one school administrator asked Charlotte about her personal interests and hobbies outside of her royal obligations. Charlotte paused for so long that the question seemed to have caught her completely off guard. Finally, she replied, "I enjoy writing and reading, and I'm learning to play piano. But I think my most important interest is understanding how to serve the Commonwealth effectively." The administrator smiled and said, "Those are wonderful pursuits, but what do you enjoy doing just for fun, without any connection to your royal duties?" Charlotte's expression suggested that the concept of activities completely separate from royal preparation was genuinely foreign to her. After another long pause, she said, "I'm not sure I understand the distinction. Everything I do helps prepare me to serve people better, so it all feels important rather than just fun." Sarah, who was present as part of the security detail during this meeting, felt her heart break a little at this exchange. Charlotte had become so focused on her future responsibilities that she had lost touch with the concept of purely recreational activities. Even at 10 years old, she viewed her entire life through the lens of service and preparation. The school visits concluded with Charlotte's acceptance to a prestigious institution known for producing diplomats and public servants. The choice was academically excellent and practically appropriate for her future role. But Sarah couldn't help wondering what opportunities for normal adolescent development had been sacrificed in favor of royal preparation. As winter gave way to spring 2025, Sarah began to compile her observations into a comprehensive account of Charlotte's development over the preceding year. Her notes revealed a child who had mastered skills that impressed seasoned professionals, who had developed a sophisticated understanding of international relations and public service, and who had assumed responsibilities that would challenge most adults. But her notes also revealed a child who had paid a significant price for these achievements. Charlotte had become isolated from typical childhood experiences, had assumed emotional burdens that seemed disproportionate to her age, and had internalized a level of self-monitoring that prevented her from experiencing the spontaneous joy that should characterize childhood. Sarah realized that her documentation represented a unique perspective on the human cost of royal preparation. As someone sworn to protect the royal family, she had to consider whether her duty extended to protecting Charlotte from the institutional pressures that were shaping her development in ways that might not be in her best long-term interests. The decision about whether to speak publicly about her observations was becoming unavoidable. Sarah's notes revealed patterns that deserved broader consideration, but breaking the traditional silence maintained by royal protection officers would be unprecedented and potentially damaging to her career. Yet watching Charlotte navigate her increasingly complex world with such lonely dignity, Sarah began to feel that someone needed to advocate for the child behind the perfectly performed royal role. The decision to speak publicly about Princess Charlotte's development came to Detective Inspector Sarah Blackwood during a seemingly routine morning in March 2025. She was conducting a security assessment at Windsor Castle when she encountered Charlotte walking alone through the long gallery, a magnificent corridor lined with portraits of previous monarchs and their families. The image would stay with Sarah forever. Charlotte, now 10 years old, moved through the grand space with perfect posture, her footsteps echoing against the ancient walls. She paused before each portrait, studying the faces of her ancestors with an intensity that seemed to Sarah like someone trying to understand her own destiny through the experiences of those who had come before her. What struck Sarah most powerfully was not Charlotte's composed behavior, which had become expected, but the profound solitude of the moment. The long gallery, despite its grandeur, felt like an isolated space where Charlotte was communing with the weight of royal history entirely on her own. She appeared to be having an internal conversation with the generations of royal duty that stretched back centuries, trying to understand her place in a story that had been written long before her birth. When Charlotte noticed Sarah's presence, she didn't start or seem surprised. Instead, she offered the same diplomatic smile she used in public engagements and continued her progression through the gallery as if leading an invisible tour group. "They all look quite serious in their portraits, don't they?" Charlotte commented, stopping before a painting of Queen Victoria. "I wonder if they were happier than they appear, or if being royal made it difficult for them to show joy." The observation was sophisticated for a 10-year-old, but what moved Sarah was the underlying question Charlotte seemed to be asking about her own future. Was happiness compatible with royal duty? Could she maintain her own emotional authenticity while fulfilling the role that history and circumstance had assigned to her? Sarah's response was careful but genuine. "I imagine they had moments of great happiness, Your Royal Highness, even if the formal portraits don't show those moments." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "I hope so. I would like to believe that serving people can bring joy, not just duty." This conversation crystallized Sarah's growing conviction that Charlotte's experience deserved documentation and public discussion. The child was grappling with questions about the compatibility of personal fulfillment and public service that even experienced royals found challenging. She was doing so with remarkable maturity, but she was doing so essentially alone. Over the following weeks, Sarah began the delicate process of transitioning from observer to advocate. She knew that speaking publicly about her observations would end her career in royal protection, but she had come to believe that Charlotte's well-being was more important than traditional protocols of silence. The final catalyst came during preparations for Charlotte's first major solo public engagement, a visit to a children's hospital that had been planned as part of her gradual introduction to independent royal duties. At 10 years old, Charlotte would be conducting this engagement without her parents' direct supervision, accompanied only by her private secretary and security detail. Sarah was part of the planning meetings for this engagement, and she watched Charlotte prepare for her first independent representation of the royal family with the same meticulous attention she brought to all her public duties. But this preparation carried additional weight because Charlotte understood that her performance would establish precedents for her future solo work. During rehearsals at the hospital, Charlotte practiced conversations with child patients, learning how to balance royal protocol with age-appropriate interaction. She studied briefing materials about the hospital's programs, memorized the names and specialties of key staff members, and even researched the medical conditions she might encounter to ensure she could have meaningful conversations with patients and their families. The level of preparation was impressive for any public figure, but watching a 10-year-old approach her first solo engagement with such comprehensive planning made Sarah feel like she was witnessing something unprecedented in royal history. Charlotte was essentially professionalizing herself, at an age when most children were focused on school projects and playground friendships. The day of the hospital visit proved to be both triumph and revelation. Charlotte's performance was flawless by any measure of royal engagement success. She connected naturally with child patients, speaking to them with warmth that seemed genuine rather than performed. She engaged meaningfully with hospital staff about their work, asking informed questions that demonstrated her preparation while maintaining conversational flow that put everyone at ease. But Sarah, observing from her security position, noticed details that the hospital staff and media representatives missed. Throughout the 2-hour engagement, Charlotte never fully relaxed. Her smile remained warm but measured, her posture perfect even during informal conversations. Her responses carefully calibrated to be appropriate for each interaction. Most telling was a moment when Charlotte was speaking with a young patient who had asked about her school friends. Charlotte's response was charming and age-appropriate, but Sarah noticed a brief hesitation before she answered, as if she had to think carefully about how to describe relationships that were complicated by her royal status. "I have lovely classmates," Charlotte replied. "We do our homework together and enjoy school activities. They're very understanding about my other responsibilities." The answer was perfect for the setting, but Sarah wondered about the reality behind Charlotte's diplomatic description. How normal could friendships be when they had to accommodate royal protocols and security requirements? How much of Charlotte's school experience was genuine peer interaction versus carefully managed social preparation? After the hospital visit, Sarah made her decision. That evening, she submitted her resignation from the Royal Protection Unit and began the process of documenting her observations for public disclosure. She understood that speaking about her experiences would be controversial and potentially damaging to the royal family, but she had come to believe that Charlotte's situation required public attention. The process of preparing her account was emotionally challenging for Sarah. Reading through months of observations about Charlotte's development, she was struck by the consistent pattern of a bright, capable child gradually losing access to normal childhood experiences as she assumed increasingly sophisticated royal responsibilities. Sarah's documentation revealed a child who had mastered diplomatic skills that impressed seasoned professionals, but who seemed to have paid a significant price in terms of spontaneous joy and peer relationships. Charlotte had become extraordinarily competent at royal duties while becoming increasingly isolated from the typical experiences of childhood. The decision to go public with her observations was made easier by Sarah's conviction that Charlotte herself would eventually benefit from broader understanding of the challenges facing young royals. Public awareness of the pressures Charlotte was navigating might lead to adjustments that would better balance her royal preparation with opportunities for normal childhood development. Sarah's first interview about her experiences was conducted with a respected royal correspondent who had covered the royal family for over 20 years. The journalist understood the significance of a royal protection officer breaking traditional silence and approached the story with appropriate seriousness. "Detective Inspector Blackwood," the journalist began, "you've served in royal protection for 8 years. What convinced you to speak publicly about your observations of Princess Charlotte?" Sarah's response had been carefully considered. "I believe in service, both to the royal family and to the public. Sometimes those two forms of service come into conflict. I've watched Princess Charlotte develop into a remarkably capable young person who approaches her royal duties with impressive dedication. But I've also watched her sacrifice aspects of childhood that most people would consider essential to healthy development." The interview continued for over 2 hours, with Sarah providing specific examples of Charlotte's behavior that illustrated both her remarkable capabilities and the costs of her accelerated royal preparation. She was careful to emphasize Charlotte's strengths and the genuine dedication she showed to her royal role, but she also documented the isolation and pressure that characterized the child's daily experience. "Princess Charlotte is an extraordinary young person," Sarah explained. "She has developed diplomatic skills that would impress experienced ambassadors, and she approaches every public engagement with genuine care for the people she meets. But she's 10 years old, and she's carrying responsibilities that would challenge most adults. Someone needs to advocate for the child behind the royal role." The interview's publication created immediate controversy. Royal commentators were divided between those who praised Sarah's advocacy for Charlotte's well-being and those who criticized her breach of traditional royal protection protocols. The palace initially declined to comment on the specific allegations, but palace sources suggested that Charlotte's development was being carefully monitored by family members and educational professionals. More significant than the immediate media response was the conversation that Sarah's revelations started about the modern challenges of raising children within the royal family. Child development experts who reviewed Sarah's observations noted patterns that suggested Charlotte might benefit from more structured opportunities for unmonitored peer interaction and unstructured play. Dr. Margaret Henley, a specialist in child psychology who had worked with families in high-pressure situations, provided context for Sarah's observations. "What we see described in Detective Inspector Blackwood's account is a child who has developed remarkable skills for managing public responsibilities, but who may be missing crucial developmental experiences, the ability to be spontaneous, to make mistakes without consequence, to form relationships based purely on personal compatibility. These are important parts of healthy childhood development. The broader conversation that emerged from Sarah's interview focused not on criticizing the royal family's parenting choices, but on recognizing the unique challenges faced by children born into positions of significant public responsibility. Charlotte's situation highlighted questions about how modern royal families could balance preparation for future duties with preservation of childhood experiences. Several months after Sarah's initial interview, she participated in a follow-up discussion that revealed the impact her revelations had had on Charlotte's daily routine. According to sources close to the family, Charlotte's schedule had been adjusted to include more unstructured time with peers and more opportunities for activities that had no connection to royal preparation. "The goal isn't to eliminate Charlotte's royal education," Sarah explained in her follow-up interview. "She's clearly suited for and interested in her future role. The goal is to ensure that her preparation for that role doesn't prevent her from experiencing the joy and spontaneity that should be part of every child's life." Sarah also revealed that she had received a personal message from Princess Charlotte, delivered through appropriate channels, thanking her for caring about my happiness as well as my royal duties. The message suggested that Charlotte herself had been aware of the pressures Sarah had observed and was grateful for adult advocacy on her behalf. The most significant long-term impact of Sarah's revelations was the broader discussion they prompted about the support systems available to young royals. Child welfare organizations began developing programs specifically designed to address the unique challenges faced by children in high-profile public roles. And educational institutions started considering how to better serve students who carried significant public responsibilities. Sarah's courage in speaking about her observations had created space for a more nuanced understanding of Charlotte's situation. Rather than simply celebrating her remarkable capabilities or criticizing the pressures she faced, the public conversation began to focus on how to support young royals in developing both the skills they would need for their future roles and the emotional resilience they would need for healthy personal lives. In her final public statement about her experience, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned from observing Charlotte's development. "Princess Charlotte taught me that children are far more capable than we often assume, but they're also more vulnerable than they might appear. She approaches her royal duties with dedication that would impress anyone, but she needs adults who will protect her right to childhood experiences alongside her preparation for adult responsibilities." Sarah's advocacy had achieved its intended goal. Public awareness of the challenges facing young royals had led to meaningful adjustments in Charlotte's routine, and broader conversations about supporting children in high-pressure situations had begun. Most importantly, Charlotte herself had received confirmation that adults were paying attention to her well-being, not just her performance in royal duties. The story of Sarah's observations and decision to speak publicly became part of a broader narrative about modern royal childhood, highlighting both the remarkable capabilities that children like Charlotte could develop and the importance of protecting their access to normal developmental experiences. It was a story that honored Charlotte's impressive dedication to her future role while advocating for her right to experience the full range of childhood emotions and relationships. Years later, Sarah would reflect that her decision to break traditional silence had been the most important service she had ever provided to the royal family. By documenting and advocating for Charlotte's childhood experience, she had helped ensure that the future princess would develop not only the skills necessary for royal duty, but also the emotional foundation necessary for a fulfilling life in service to others. The untold story of Charlotte's early royal development had become a told story, one that would influence how future generations of young royals were supported in balancing public duty with personal development. Sarah's courage in speaking had created space for Charlotte to be both a capable future princess and a protected child, ensuring that her remarkable potential could develop within a framework that honored both her royal destiny and her fundamental right to childhood joy.